showing up in Aloha shirts on Friday. So,
and there he is, Phil Waters, off to a great start here. Losing my voice. Phil Waters in a Hawaiian shirt. What's up, STS Nation? Welcome to another episode of Surviving the Survivor, the podcast that brings you the best guests in all of true crime. It is time for your Friday True Crime Phil with Phil Waters and Scott Duffey, a show that's so good we bring it to you every Friday live at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. The man in the Hawaiian shirt who spends part of the year there, I might add, is America's most respected detective, Phil Waters, spending decades in law enforcement, 23 years of them as a homicide detective in the Houston PD, investigating more than 400 homicide cases. Phil is also a Marine and the owner of Kindred Spirits Investigations. If you need to keep an eye on your spouse, your wife, or your husband, you call Phil. He'll make sure everything's in order. He's also the star of the show, The Interrogator. And then you've got Agent Scott Duffey, who I refer to as a silent assassin. He's quiet, but he's always paying attention. He is the director of Wilmington University's Criminal Justice Institute, spent years as an FBI agent, special agent out of the Delaware office, investigating crime matters, gangs, bank robberies, part of the Fugitive Task Force, all of that stuff. And prior to the FBI, served 5.5 years as a Pennsylvania police officer. It is Friday. It's been a long week. Bee's Knees already writes, "Woot, the Phil abides." I love it. So feel free to throw us questions about anything. You can even ask Phil where he gets his shirts. But
I need to, Joel.
Yes, sir.
I need to offer another correction.
Oh, excuse me.
On something that I said last week.
Yeah.
So we were talking about, I brought in the mass murder that occurred in 1966 in Chicago with the 8 nurses that were slaughtered by a suspect named, last name was Speck. And last week I used the name Gary Speck. That was incorrect. His name was actually Richard Speck. So I wanted to make sure that I corrected that for the record, and I'm always willing, as I have said before, when I'm wrong, I'll admit to it.
And he just did. He corrected himself. And I'm glad you brought Richard Speck up, because not this Sunday, but I believe the following Sunday, we are going to have Ann Burgess, one of the original people who helped form the FBI Mindhunter unit, will be on the show with Dr. Gary Bricado and former FBI Special Agent Jeff Wood to discuss issues of mass murder and gang mass murder. And one of the people that you're going to be talking about is Richard Speck. So I'm excited about that because I don't know much about him, to be honest, but we will learn from the best. That is 1 week from this Sunday, I believe, live at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So the evildoer, Phil Waters, will not speak his name. I have to say it occasionally, but we are talking about the suspect in the Idaho 4 murders, Brian Kohberger. Can't seem to escape the news cycle, this story. And there is information out there reported first by News Nation and Ashley Banfield, but then picked up elsewhere. And this is a source close to the investigation. We talked about all this last week. Now reporting that Ethan's best friend, not DM, the surviving witness, in fact called 911. There were reports that it was DM's phone that was used, and apparently that is correct. But according to the story, Ethan Chapin, as we know, was found dead in bed with his girlfriend, Xana Kernodle, and the person that found him was a longtime friend of Ethan Chapin, who went as far, according to the source, as to check his pulse before calling 911. Detective Phil Waters, to you first. Hearing this, does this change how you're looking at this case in any way, shape, or form? Or are we just learning that a friend of Ethan's is the one that called police?
Well, you know,
Phil is a thinking man. I like this.
Well, you know, my general comment is that these kinds of leaks provided by these unnamed sources, I think, does a huge disservice to Maddie and Kaylee and Ethan and Zana. And I think it is disrespectful to those families to have this stuff constantly shoved into the media, into the news. And and this may be the shortest program we have, Joel. I am, I don't know if the word is uncomfortable, but I am not terribly enthusiastic about talking about stuff that is shoved out into the media for just the purpose of creating another discussion about what if and who did this and was that strange and why are we looking at these people and this and that and this and that. Because I think I don't think, number one, it serves the investigation. I don't think it serves the investigation, of which is still ongoing. This thing has not been concluded. They are still putting together pieces of this puzzle to have as complete a picture as they can have for the prospective prosecution of the evildoer. And what bothers me about some of this stuff is that we're going to, I'm kind of looking into the future here, but this gets dangerously close to remembering. We have to remember within our system of justice that the evildoer is presumed innocent. It is the prosecution's burden, the state's burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he did what he is alleged to have done. So looking at it from through that prism, what I'm concerned about is these types of issues that continually get brought up, are perhaps could nullify a jury pool later on. And this, of course, gets into, if he's convicted, does he have grounds for an appeal based on these types of issues? So, to comment on that particular aspect of this thing, to me, because it's another source, it's another, here we go, we're putting this out here. We don't know what we don't know, but somebody said it, so let's report it. I think I'm just going to defer to the family and these young people, and I just that particular issue. I mean, it doesn't matter to me. Yeah. Again, this may be the shortest one we do, but I don't care. I don't care what that person is saying. I don't care about that. I just think it's.
I think it's interesting to get Phil's perspective on this, because he's been doing this a really long time, and I agree with him. There's some other issues in play that I think are a little more tangible and not really based off of sources. But and by the way, J. Thomas Reset correcting me. I was not in bed; it was in the doorway, and that is correct. News Nation actually got that wrong. And I repeated what they got wrong. So that's why you got to be careful with media outlets as well. But J. Thomas Reset is always on the case. And then we've got Curiosity Killed the Cats. Yay, I finally made it to live. Excited. Hi, everyone. Nice to have you, Curiosity. But Scott, want to give you a chance to respond to this too. Then we'll move on to some other things. And for those of you watching, you can ask Phil and Scott about Phil's Ferrari. You can ask them about other cases. You can ask about whatever you want today. It is a Friday fun day, despite some of the subject matter that we are talking about. So, Scott, to you, so there is, again, this report, and I totally get what Phil is saying. News Nation was kind enough to withhold the best friend's name, but said that he is the person who almost after 8 hours dialed 911 and called 911 using DM's phone. Again, does this influence your thinking in this case, knowing this information?
No, it doesn't influence. Let's just say it's true. The we know what we have in the affidavit. That's for public consumption. Everything else that's behind the scenes, the investigation, who called, how many were in the house, that came to the house afterwards. For example, if let's just say for argument's sake, this source is true and somebody now comes into the scene and notifies law enforcement through somebody else's phone, it doesn't change any of the facts of the case, because the facts of the case that have been put out in the affidavit and then all the facts that haven't come out as a result of Idaho's strict adherence to no information other than what goes through the courts. And that's ultimately how we got this information. Things made it through the courts. The affidavit finally had to come to light. So you could have a half dozen more people. It's a half dozen more people that might have come to the scene to be with their friend, to be there for moral support to their friends. That's additional witness information or whoever else on the scene that is interviewed by law enforcement, and all that when it comes out and who's been talked to and how they've been talked to. And, that's additional fingerprints that law enforcement would have to obtain to make sure that, you can rule certain prints out and whatnot that may, people touching things. So it may add to the confusion. It is for speculation. It is for discussion, but ultimately it doesn't change anything, any of my thoughts of what already been told by police. So you have, additional people that are there.
So you see, guys, you got two seasoned investigators who are unflappable, not really moved. This is more of a media play, and that's my world. So kind of circling back, Fast and Curious, I love these names. Based on the new information, what did Phil and Scott believe happened based on their expert opinion? I think Phil basically said he's not going to speculate on that, along with Scott. Thanks, guys. Love all three of you. Great minds. Phil, is that how you would answer this person? And then let me throw this up, too, so you can respond. Anita, is he trying to say that you, Joel, are creating something or other media sources? Probably both, which is fine. But no, I mean, Phil, just to round it out, and feel free to respond to that, too. But are you you're just not comfortable speculating about unnamed sources, I take it?
Well, I'm with Scott on this. I mean, we know what we know. We know what we had in the affidavit. We know those are facts leading to the truth about what happened, and the full scope of everything will be revealed if this thing goes to a trial. And if it doesn't go to a trial and there ends up being a plea, then it will be public information, and there will be show upon show upon show, which will be explaining all the background information that was gathered in this investigation. So again, because you know what's going to happen here. If Scott and I say something and address this and we're wrong, then holy cow, Katie bar the door, because now the floodgates will come out with all the haters. We'll see, we told you those guys. So, and then if we don't say anything, then we're criticized for that too. So, but I'm going to err on the side of I don't care whether they criticize me either way. I'm just saying that we know what we know, and I think you're in addressing that you're part of this this thing. Well, you're the host of this particular podcast. It is yours. And it is an issue that is in the news. So I don't think it was irresponsible that you brought it up. And we have now responded to it. And if those watching are not happy with that response, well, okay.
It's a free country. And Phil was a Marine, fought for our freedom. So we've got Gemma Gitta here. There are so many things we don't know yet. I lived in a house with 4 roommates in college circa 1993, and we each had our own room. Very common to lock our bedroom doors if people were over. So Gemma just showing us that probably a smart move. And then this one back from Curiosity Killed the Cats who joined us. Question concerning the whole roommate situation, and Scott, I'll defer to you on this. I'd like to know Scott's advice and Phil's advice for individuals that have drugs, etc., at a crime scene. Should they just leave to not contaminate the crime scene?
Yes, leave it as is, right?
That's a short answer. Yeah.
You're talking to the FBI guy that handled drug cases, so good guy to ask.
Yeah, everything. It's, law enforcement is going first and foremost to respond to a tragedy, a major criminal incident. They then, through their investigation, realize 4 young lives have been cut down in their prime by homicide, and so everything in that house becomes is like frozen in time, and of course, imagine just imagine every viewer watching this and wonder, you're in your house, you have whatever you have in your house, and then something takes place where law enforcement has to come in. First and foremost, they secure the scene, but then a search warrant is obtained to continue of their investigation, and that crime scene won't be left behind. They'll know what looks like's been moved, tampered, thrown out, flushed, whatever have you. Let's just say you have a bunch of underage, I'll keep it simple, with underage alcohol. And so you have a whole bunch of bottles that are tossed that looks like, hey, so I mean, those things happen, right? And what other contraband might exist in the rooms that have nothing to do with the actual rooms of the crime scene, right? Police are not there to charge everybody for everything that they've uncovered. That's not what they're there for. They're there for victims and to serve justice for the survivors and the friends and family, etc. So yes, of course, it'd be tough not to, oh my gosh, I have a pipe, I have this, I have that, and where do I put it? And so it would look like, if you're tampering with something that has nothing to do with the crime scene, then what's to say that you have something else to hide, right? It ultimately law enforcement saying that's not my issue, and whatever you are, the witness you may be, and the crime and the evidence to locate a perpetrator or perpetrators at that time, because they don't know, is the most important thing. And they'll rest assured to everybody that they're talking, hey, if you have nothing to do with this crime that we're here for, don't worry about everything else that we may or may not find that could either be embarrassing or, of course, of another criminal matter.
Now we got Jay Thomas is back, a friend of the show, but might not be friends with Phil after this comment. Let me help Phil. Things leaked can compromise, in all caps, the investigation, case, etc. Do you care to respond to Jay?
Well, I really appreciate that, Jay Thomas reset, that you're helping me out. And I think you just affirmed what I'd already said, but that's okay. And I think that picture, is that the one that Jonathan thinks looks like Yeah, that looks like Hunter Biden, doesn't it? Isn't that what Jonathan said? Oh.
Those are the bushy eyebrows, Jay.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, that was it. That was it. Yeah.
Jay, you gotta be careful of those bushy eyebrows. Here we go. On to a collection of cells. Phil, I'll let you take this one. I just don't see where he can ever have, this is the evildoer, a fair trial, because the majority of the country and beyond have heard about this case. Just to point out, right now we're covering the Alec Murdaugh trial in South Carolina, where pretty much everyone knows that family in the state of South Carolina. And it appears at the moment that he's getting a fair trial, as far as we know. But there are people, Phil, that have not heard about this case. There are a lot of true crime fanatics that are heavily involved, invested, and pay a lot of attention. But I have talked to plenty of people, even in Idaho, believe it or not, that have not heard about this. So what say you?
Well, I think he will get a fair trial. I would imagine that the defense attorneys will, the first rattle out of the box, will ask for a change of venue, and they will find a place there in Idaho where there will be a fair trial. So you're right. I mean, we're in this bubble of looking at this stuff and talking about this stuff, and everybody that's interested in it and commenting and so forth. And that's not a I'm not trying to discount anyone or criticize. I'm just saying that we're in that bubble. There are plenty of people, as you've already alluded to, Joel, plenty of people that are not. And so I think they will accomplish that. And as time goes on, hopefully some of this stuff will start to fade. And by the time this thing comes around to a trial, if it does, then we'll have a jury pool that will be able to provide an objective appraisal of what they see in terms of evidence and come back with a verdict.
Carolyn Hall writes, thanks, Phil and Scott. Glad you're both here. Who knows if what was supposedly reported about the evildoer is factual? News Nation needs to stop reporting nonsense and let the case play out. So this is what I find interesting. And I was on the other side of this, working for the big media outlets. And, on the one hand, you can argue they're doing their job. And Ashley has a show, Banfield I'm talking about. And she's got to fill an hour every night. And a lot of this stuff is fair game. But one thing I have always known to be true is you can't really fake the audience. Sincerity and being genuine comes across. And, there are plenty of times where I think you could argue that they are reporting things that would fall on the sensationalistic side of the spectrum, hoping to get, numbers, meaning ratings. And, and I think, as you can tell by Carolyn's comment, people can read through that. I think that's one of the big issues with large media outlets is that they tend to underestimate the audience and their intelligence. So,
to address what Carolyn was talking about here, Joel, I've been on Banfield several times.
Sure.
And what I have tried to do, as I try to do anytime I'm on anywhere, is just provide a voice of reason, not get into the hysterics of the questions that are being asked, and try to answer those questions in a way that makes the greatest amount of sense to the people that are watching. I do not want to get caught in, just as you've talked about, I do not want anyone to think that's viewing what I'm saying, that I'm talking down to them, or that I think they're idiots and, they don't even get it. So I've just tried to be kind of, when I've been asked a question, when Ashley's asked me a question that may sound a little heightened, because of the way she does her show, I've just tried to provide a more calm answer that would kind of tamp down maybe the atmosphere with which that question was answered, if that makes sense.
100%. LJ writes, the media's behavior has been repugnant, but that's not new, of course. And then Scott, this one's in your wheelhouse here from Sarah Tomlinson. There are drug houses everywhere. What does it have to do with this case, even if it was a drug house? Assuming that there were drugs being dealed out of this house, does that even matter now that we've got 4 young college students brutally murdered?
No, I don't think it would matter. It's unless, of course, there was any evidence whatsoever that there's a drug rival murder. You know, of course, then the drugs come in play if the drugs were part of the motive in another type of case. And having investigated drug gangs a pretty good part of my life, drugs was the center factor for many of the crimes of violence. But in this case or any other tragic homicide where drugs are not an issue. Now, of course, toxicology reports are done, and the witnesses, if there are any that can offer something that to the actual, you know, for example, what I heard, what I saw, that's just going to be an interview from law enforcement to say you're reasonable, you're sound, and the question's going to be asked, hey, when's the last time you might have had drink or alcohol or maybe, you know, some drugs, just to help understand what type of witness you can be. But the drugs in the house, alcohol in the house, any type of contraband in a typical college house, that doesn't mean every college kid, but, you know, we understand college is a time that can be people getting out for the first time of their houses and experimenting and doing whatever and living life. And that wouldn't come into play. That wouldn't change anything. And that's why I said ultimately, where an individual who may be a victim of circumstance, where they're not a direct part of what had taken place, but may have something, just leave it as is, explain it. And law enforcement definitely will take it. But you know, I know in my experiences, when I've come across something like that, yes, of course, we would take it and put it into evidence and then destroy it later. But I would never have used it against somebody or charged somebody for something so different and disconnected to the crime that I'm there for. And so I just feel like it's a piece of the story, but if it's not connected, then it should not matter, and law enforcement would not play it up in any way.
Scott Duffey, the voice of reason. Now, we've got an argument going on the side here between Sarah and Total Jag. And he writes, really, Sarah, Brian is being set up. And then he responds and says, with no murder weapon, he will walk. Bunch of BS. So, Phil Waters, this is America, the land of the free, First Amendment. And already we are getting a preview in some ways of what could one day go on in the deliberation room, right? I mean, one person thinks one way, another person thinks another way, and you've got to let the justice system play out here, correct?
Well, yes, and the difference will be is that those people in the deliberation room will have seen all of the evidence. I can tell you that the fact that there's not been a weapon recovered is so far down on the pole of need in the investigation. They have so many other affirmative links to this thing that it would be nice, but there were many cases that I worked where the murder weapon was not recovered, or we were taken to where the suspect believed they had disposed of it but didn't find it. It did not alter the ultimate outcome once the case was tried and all the evidence was presented.
Marie P. writes, you don't even need a body in some cases to prove murder, which is correct. There's a whole other issue here in play that we kind of touched upon last time. And now the old gray lady, the New York Times, once one of the pinnacles of journalism and the pillars of journalism. Some would argue that it no longer is what it once was, but nevertheless, they still do a lot of reporting. So they came out and also reported about this argument that more than an argument, a problem that Brian Kohberger, the evildoer, was having at Washington State University. He was counseled over a verbal altercation with a professor that ultimately got him fired from his teaching assistant position. They call it an altercation with a gentleman named John Snyder. He is a Wazoo, Washington State professor. It happened, Scott, less than 2 weeks before the killings in November, according to the New York Times. And it really rankled faculty members there, and people were very concerned about his growing behavioral issues. And then after the November 13 killings, those concerns allegedly, according to his reports, grew even more. At one point, he was also accused of, and this is according to the New York Times now, following a female student to her car. You'll never see the New York Times with one source. This is according to multiple people familiar with this situation. I think I asked you this last time, but how closely are investigators combing through what happened on the campus, 10 minutes away at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, to see what was going on with Brian Kohberger before and after these murders? Looks like he was having some issues, at least from a teaching perspective, with some of the other professors.
Are you asking me?
Let's go to Scott on this, and then we'll.
I can guarantee you, law enforcement is going through every imaginable, and even better when you have something that is on paper that's been documented prior to the event, right? Or even post the event, when the event is still, or the homicides have been still considered, or where they're looking for a suspect, right? And so law enforcement now zeroes in on a suspect, and that's why information is put out, because there are parts of the country that we may not even be aware of, where this individual has traveled and has had some sort of altercation, interaction, whatever it is, something that's outside the norm that causes somebody to be suspicious, that causes somebody to be upset, where either law enforcement gets involved, or if this story is correct, where the stories with regards to his interactions on campus, and it's been documented in some file somewhere. Those are great for law enforcement, as long as it feeds into the theories where evidence has taken law enforcement. And so there was an aspect in the affidavit mentioned by the detective of possible stalking, and then in the affidavit backed up that possible stalking, not saying that stalking is a key here, but that it is a possibility for leading to the homicides. And so putting together how many times has his car and an image of him captured somewhere, whether in connection with the house location or where they were employed or had socialized. So it's key, and I guarantee you law enforcement is simply continuing to build just another piece of information that could go into a puzzle, or where it's simply disregarded, but yet forever recorded, and will ultimately come out in discovery, right? That either defense will say, yeah, it's something that helps us, something that hurts us, and as well as the prosecution. That's the great thing about investigations. There's lots of evidence that is obtained that supports your theory, that supports the investigation and your conclusions, and then some things that are really just irrelevant could be used to distract, right? But ultimately, as Phil had said, a jury will be seated if they proceed with a trial, and you know, time has been tested that there are great jury pools out there where people just put on their thinking cap and shut out all the noise of the outside and say what is being portrayed in a courtroom, what is relevant, and ultimately which witness and all the information, who do you trust, and then they're going to make a decision based upon what's been provided in a courtroom.
LJ writes, Phil and even spelled Phil right. Phil and Scott are awesome. All caps. Thank you for having them, Joel. My pleasure. Makes my job easier. This is a conversation going on the sidebar, if you will. And Phil, I was wondering if you could address this. Sarah writes, I have a taser and mace. Phil, I know you have daughters, I think plural. What advice do you have for young women stepping far away from the evildoer story, but just in general? You're a young woman, you're in your mid-20s, you know, maybe you work late and you go to a parking lot to your car. How should you prepare yourself in the event of something happening that you do not want to happen? Any advice on this?
Well, I mean, what I've told my daughters, what I would tell anyone asking that question. I have a granddaughter that's at Pratt up in New York City. And she's already told me about an incident where some guy walked up to her while she was, you know, having a latte there, I guess, on some sidewalk cafe setting. And some guy walks up to her and says, "Give me your money." Some homeless guy, you know, walks up. She's kind of like, "What?" He's like, "Give me your money." And she was a little shocked. So she kind of gets in a discussion with this guy, ultimately gives him $50 and he leaves. Well, she's just been robbed. So a couple of things. Of course, I asked her, what were you doing? And of course, what was she doing? Well, she's buried in that freaking phone. So I would say this, men and women, but women in particular, need to be aware of what's going on around them. I'm not talking about being paranoid. I'm just talking about being aware of your surroundings. And anytime that you can go from one place to another with someone else is always better. It's always better. If you're out there running solo, you are just a more desirable target, because these folks that go out and commit these crimes of aggravated robbery, of sexual assault, of murder, these people that do these types of things, they pick their victims, and they pick their victims based on how their victims are behaving. So even cop killers, there was a cop killer that was interviewed. This has been a while back, just to get inside his head. Why did you do this? Well, he'd gotten mad, you know, about something, and the police have been involved. And so from that point forward, he hates the police. So what he did was he went out one night specifically to find a cop to kill. And he was doing things to get stopped. So the first officer that stopped him was very aware of his training, his street survival training, and conducted that stop in that mode. This guy said to himself, "This is not the one. This is not the cop." And so he went on about his business, and then he finally came across the cop that stopped him, who was not that tactically aware in the stop, and he murdered him. So it happens. In law enforcement, there's called the 10 deadly sins, and any one of these things or combination thereof can get you killed. complacency, relaxing too soon, not knowing your equipment, so forth and so on. So these crooks, these bad people, these evildoers, they're out here and they're on the prey. They're looking for their targets. So I would say, to address this direct question about what should females be aware of, is number one, travel in pairs, travel in groups. If you are traveling by yourself, be aware of what's going on and get your face out of that phone. I see people every day walking and they're buried in the phone. They're in the restaurant. They're buried in the phone. Everything they do, if they ever took that phone away from them, I don't know what they'd do. I guess they would just go apoplectic and throw themselves on their back. It's just get out of these phones. I worked an officer involved assault where a suspect, she was working an extra job at a Walmart, I believe. She was working an extra job at a Walmart. She was security for the Walmart, sitting at the front door area on a stool. And what do you think she was doing? Here we go. I'm on the phone. This guy walks in there with a knife and proceeds to carve her up. Almost killed her. She almost lost, I think, her left arm because of the damage he did. Thank the Lord that our patrol officers had just been issued tourniquets. So the officer, and were trained on how to use them. And when the officers arrived at the scene, because of that particular piece of equipment, they saved her life and saved her arm. So the moral of the story is, get your face out of these phones when you're traveling from one location to another, or if you're in a place where you need to be aware of your surroundings, get off the phone. If you've got to get on the phone for some reason, then go someplace that's isolated, that's away from everybody else, and take care of your business, then go back out to your post or your station, whatever it may be. And in regards to carrying mace, OC spray, or that kind of thing.
Yeah, the taser dangerous to carry?
Well, I mean, the danger there is, number one, you got to be up close and personal to use a taser. So to use a stun gun. And I would say, and look, that OC spray and those stun guns, sometimes all they do is piss them off even more. So I've seen throughout my career, I was issued a taser in homicide. I mean, they issued everybody tasers. I wore it. In fact, I never wore it, never used it. But they're neat. They're neat. I mean, they're cool in a lot of different situations. It keeps the officer from having to have physical contact, and that way protects the officer and ultimately protects the suspect that they're trying to apprehend. So, but those types of things, I don't know that I would make a blanket statement either way. If you are comfortable carrying those things, but you better be trained on how to use them. Now, especially with the OC spray stuff, I can tell you that I saw more officers that OC sprayed themselves than they did the suspect. So I'm just telling you, and these are trained guys. I'm just telling you, when you start spraying that stuff around, it's going to get on everybody. So be aware. I told my granddaughter, I said, what I'm going to send her is I'm going to go find my old police whistle, and I'm going to send that to her, and I'm going to have her wear it around her neck. And if she has the opportunity, certainly if somebody comes up, approaches her, I've told her that the minute you see somebody approaching you that you don't feel comfortable with, you need to get that thing out and start blowing that whistle. Because it's such a shrill sound. I mean, it's a killer. So
how would this have been different if you were with her when this happened?
If I was with her when
he asked for the money. What would you have done?
Well, number one, he wouldn't have walked up and asked her. He wouldn't have made that demand, number one. But because she was by herself, she's buried in her phone, she wasn't aware, he was on her like that. And that's the way she described it. Now, if I was there and this person was foolish enough to come up,
yes,
then he would be respectfully asked to move to another location or suffer the consequences.
Just wanted to see how you would phrase that. All right, here. Gemma Gita here. Since the state of Idaho is paying for the evildoer's defense, does he get added luxury, quote unquote, to hire a jury specialist for jury selection? Or does that nonsense not apply since he can't hire one himself? Scott Duffey, any idea about this?
Yeah, and I've been in those situations with federal crimes and going to federal court. So anytime that a public defender, the public defense, that is a state appointed attorney, is there is whatever that defense attorney needs to put on a good defense is going to be afforded him or her. So it's even though it's a state funded defense, the attorney, as long as they make the requests, they're going to bill the state. They're going to and of course it changes state to state. But there is I don't know about so much a hired professional as opposed to, for example, in prosecutors' offices that I worked, and knowing the public defender's office where I had worked, there were people I would say that were a little more attuned to advising both prosecutors and defense attorneys in helping assisting in the choosing of a juror, dismissing of a juror. And so, yeah, I would say just because it's a public defender's office, and I know some very good public defenders, they can make a request for whatever they need to put on a defense that is right for their client.
Phil, this is a classic media story. Creme 2, they're the local affiliate, I believe CBS, out of Spokane, Washington. They did a whole story on Idaho taxpayers are going to be on the hook for thousands of dollars. I've been in these newsroom meetings. Let's go out and talk about how this is going to hurt, Joe and Jill's pockets and their bottom line. Is this much ado about nothing? The bottom line here is that Ann Taylor, who is the public defender, who's been cleared, by the way, of any conflict, according to some other reports, is now going to be paid $200 an hour. I believe it comes out to, $300-something thousand a year annually if she was being paid that way. News stations love to do this. When you hear this, do you care at all or no?
No.
Good answer.
I mean, that's the short answer, right? I mean, look, under the Constitution, the evildoer is provided a vigorous defense. If that's what it costs for a public defender to defend him in Idaho, then so be it. That's the way it is. To say that the taxpayers are on the hook, any one of them in the same situation would be on the hook. So, yeah, that to me, that's just it's a disingenuous argument. That's just a distraction.
There are certain stories like that no matter what the story is, the news director will say, well, how does this affect, the average Joe or Jill in Idaho? And they go out and they do these stories. And that's why I think alternative media is starting to do better than mainstream media. Scott, to you, Fallon writes, I can't believe the coroner said toxicology would not be important here. If Ethan's drink was drugged at the party that night, diminishing his capacity to fight back when attacked, that would be relevant. Do you agree?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what is said there by the coroner. The only thing I could think of where the coroner is saying the toxicology of the victim is not relevant, I would agree. It's not relevant to the crime of homicide, right? And going after the perpetrator that committed this horrific act. In other words, there's nothing to be used negatively by against the victim, as opposed to a totally different scenario where you have two individuals that are walking out of a bar, both intoxicated, and then one starts or stumbles on the other, and then a fight ensues. Thereby, I can see where toxicology and who's, you're both inhibited, and they're having relevance. So I think, and there might just be misconstrued. I can see the coroner saying it's just not having relevance in the case for to change anything with regards to whether this victim could fight back or not. That's the only thought I have on that, as opposed to making, in other words, there should be no negative reference to the victim, regardless of what their toxicology is, high or low or zero. If that sounds, if that answered that question.
Yes, that makes perfect sense to me. Switching gears a bit, and we can bounce back and forth here between the evildoer case and Alec Murdaugh. But Alec Murdaugh, we've been covering that on Surviving the Survivor full time, basically, as this trial continues. By the way, shout out to Louise Rouleau, who I know is watching us in Canada. Phil, there was a lot of gamesmanship in court in the Alec Murdaugh trial late this week. I think as recently as yesterday, Dick Harpootlian is the defense attorney, and they had a forensics and ballistics expert on, and the defense is going to make their case starting next week. And he kept harping, Dick Harpootlian, harping on the angles of these shots that killed Maggie and Paul, the wife and the son in this case. And the fact that they came from a low angle. And the presumption is that the defense is going to now present a two-shooter theory next week, saying that there were two shooters because there were two guns involved. You are one of the expert investigators in all the land. What's your take on this? I mean, it's a job of a defense attorney, obviously, to raise reasonable doubt. But, and I don't know, to be totally honest, how closely you followed this case, but what about two shooters here?
Well, from what I have seen, the prosecution, in my judgment, is doing a remarkable job in connecting all the affirmative links to Murdaugh. I think it's even some of the comments that Murdaugh made in the interview and some of the things that he has said where he's done this, I think he's made an admission that would seem to indicate that he didn't give necessarily a full confession. At least I haven't seen that anywhere, but he's made some admissions at the scene or at the time or very closely thereafter that certainly if I were interviewing him, it would indicate to me that the problem is with those interviews, at least what I've read, is that the person interviewing him didn't pick up on those things and pursue them and then ultimately have him demonstrate what he did, how he held the weapons, where he got them from, so forth and so on. So, but regarding the two weapon thing, I think the defense is going to have a tough time given the full scope of this evidence that we've seen so far, trying to explain that there were two shooters simply because there were two guns. Because at this point, and I haven't watched the entire trial, but what I have seen, what I have watched, it would appear that all the evidence is leading to Murdaugh. It's leading to Alex Murdaugh. And then the question would be, if not him, then who?
That's the big question.
So to suggest, and look, the defense has got a tough job here. They've got insurmountable evidence to try to climb over or try to explain away or something of that nature. But it is, while the defense does not have to prove he didn't do it, that is still ultimately what the defense tries to do in any case, right? And it's, you can't prove a negative, so you can't just walk in and say he didn't do it, and then offer proof that he didn't do it, right? So I think the 2-gun thing, I think that's, again, this is just based on what I've seen, is that Murdaugh's a lawyer. Now, he wasn't much of a prosecutor. I think he was a contracted, he wasn't like his family, you know, his father and grandfather and so forth. They were actually the solicitors, but he was in that office, I think, on a contract basis. But he's been around it enough that it would almost seem that he did what he did thinking like the defense would be offered later if he got caught. I mean, he's such a strange character to me that it's almost like he outsmarted himself. It's like he almost knew too much about the system, and he tried to finagle and manipulate the system and come up with this crazy story. So I don't think the 2-shooter, you know, the guy on the grassy knoll and the guy on the depository, I don't think that's going to work here.
That's what they're going to try. They're actually calling it the grassy knoll theory here.
Oh, are they really?
Yeah. That's what some people are calling.
I hadn't heard that, but
yeah. So it's there's so much going on. I mean, the biggest piece of evidence against Alec Murdaugh and for the state is that there is now you bury your nose in the phone, but sometimes it pays off, because his son was firing off some videos to his friend. One is a Snapchat video that's actually over an hour before the time of the murders. This is not as problematic, but you see him in a totally different set of clothing, keeping in mind that it's South Carolina, June 7th. So there's a good chance he just changed his clothes. But the other video was him down at the dog kennels, Scott. And according to the state's timeline, the murders happened at 8:50 p.m. And Alec Murdaugh multiple times said he was nowhere near these dog kennels where the murders happened. And he was never there, he says. And then every witness who has taken the stand who knows Alec Murdaugh, you can hear his voice on this cell phone at 8:44, putting him at the murder scene. That leaves you 6 minutes to be gone and not know of anything. Is that just too much, you think, Scott, in terms of one critical piece of evidence that might persuade the jury here to find him guilty?
It's always hard to figure out what a jury is thinking, and both sides equally feel that they have done a great job and that the jury is going to be on one side or the other, and that's after all the evidence has been put on. So I have been a witness to where, hey, I was in that courtroom and I would vote guilty or not guilty, and then to see the opposite, right? It's but it does sound like the evidence has been, as Phil said, pointing in one direction, and that's the prosecution saying Alex Murdaugh did this and no one else. But you're also talking about an individual too that has a lot of education, a lot of forethought, and I go back to what I'd said previous. There are admissions, right, to family members, to law enforcement first arriving on scene, taking initial interviews. So both one recorded, and then the others just at least going from a witness's memory, where there's indication of guilt. And so I can easily see that defense has to try to create, again, a distraction method. Hey, there's 2 guns, thereby it must be 2 people, as opposed to somebody who really, as he had said, I believe to his sister, whoever did this must have been thinking about this for a long time. And so that would indicate if you're thinking about this for a long time, there's a lot of premeditation, a lot of planning that goes into it. And what better way to throw the jury, knowing there's going to be a future trial in this, but obtain 2 weapons. And you're right, the video and the voices being captured so close to that timeline of when the homicides occurred. Just very difficult for someone to say otherwise. It's, you know, you follow the evidence, and a good jury is going to take that evidence to the deliberation room and reasonably come up with an answer.
And another big point to make is that we know that the two weapons used were family weapons owned by the Murdaughs. So if two random people were coming to commit a crime and had to do it in 6 minutes, they were probably going to come prepared with their own weapons. But what do I know? Kevin Callahan writes, it's hard to believe these two calm men, Scott and Phil, on your show have put away a lot of bad guys in their work days behind bars. God bless them. Let me tell you something.
Thank you.
And I'm a big fight fan. You know who the calmest, nicest guys on earth are? Fighters, because they know they can kick the crap out of you. So they're low key. That's why these guys are low key, because they've been there. Lil Bit writes, this is so true. Situational awareness. My two daughters are always buried in their phone. And that is, not only do we talk about true crime here, we offer public service. So make sure your kids are not buried with their heads in their phone. By the way, Phil and Scott, I am sending my 8- and 7-year-old daughter, and starting next week, my almost 4-year-old son are getting jiu-jitsu lessons, because I think it builds confidence and it is the #1 self-defense against rape. So at least you can trip up someone or do something along those lines.
That is good. My son, we put him into karate training in the Chuck Norris program when he was 7. He's a 2nd-degree black belt in the Chung Kuk Do style with Chuck Norris's people. And that is a great, putting them in jiu-jitsu, that is great, because it does teach them discipline, to stand up for themselves and to be aware of what's going on around them. But I would say, you know, regarding the cell phone stuff, that goes for men as well. I can tell you that when I've put together, I think I told you, Joel, that I had put together the security for the Republican Party of Texas convention at the GRB in Houston, Texas last year. And we had a lot of HPD officers who were working that venue for security for the convention. And I can tell you that I would walk around just to check my guys on the post. And whenever I saw anyone, and these were police officers sitting right there, and they're doing the same thing, buried in that freaking phone. And I would walk up to them, and I would put my finger in their head, and I'd go, bang, you're dead. And they never saw me until I did that. So somebody on here was talking about their 2 daughters and awareness and that kind of thing. And that is exact. I can tell you, you cannot beat the situational awareness and defending yourself. We've seen this video here, this young lady that was working out in an apartment workout room, I believe it was. Yes. And she sees a guy come to the door.
This is viral right now. You can Google woman in gym attack.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I think it was in the early morning hours, if I'm not mistaken. But she's the only one in there. A guy that she knows from the apartment comes up to the door. She thinks, you know, he wants to get in. He forgot his key or whatever to work out. Of course, she opens the door for him. And the minute she opens the door for him, this guy starts just thinking he's going to have some liaison with her. And she ain't having any of it. And the guy tries to chase her. Anyway, she defends herself. She gets out of that situation. And then there's an interview with her later on, and she just talks about, she goes, I'm just not going to give in to these people. And I think that is the right attitude. You know, it's the fight or flight. And if you can't flight, then you need to fight. And that's a perfect example of it. And kudos to her. That was amazing. That was amazing.
Carolyn Hall writes, Phil, you always do a great job on STS. Yes, he does, and that's why he's on every week. And Banfield, my issue with Ashley, who I actually like doing these one-offs, it seems like it's just for ratings. I don't want the media to jeopardize the case. Followed here by Corgi Mama, such a wonderful host, guest channel. Thank you so much. I'm so sick of the evildoer being bullied as a kid. He was probably doing his inappropriate behaviors, and the young girls handled it the best way they knew how. There is no way to rationalize what that guy did in any way, shape, or form at all. I'm just checking out some of these other comments. Jay Thomas Reset is resetting, heading back to work. Good luck there, Jay. There is an other, yeah, this person says $200 an hour. Jesus, you know what? I should have went to law school. It's never too late. So let's pivot for 1 second. We are going to start picking up this story on Surviving the Survivor beginning this Sunday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern with my lovely mother. Got to go back in time here to January 26, 2011. A blizzard hits Philadelphia, prompting Ellen Greenberg, remember that name, Ellen Greenberg, to leave work and return to her Manayunk apartment. That's like a well-to-do suburb of Philadelphia. She's living with her fiance, Sam Goldberg. He is a TV producer working for NBC News, which is where I used to work, and I believe now works for golf.com. She, Ellen Greenberg, for those of you know, and I'm just learning about this case, was stabbed, died as a result of 20 stab wounds, including 10 to her back and neck. There were also 11 bruises on her right abdomen, on her right arm, abdomen, and right leg. No suicide note was found. The death was ruled a homicide, I believe, initially, and then the coroner reversed the ruling and ruled it a suicide in February 2011. And now there's some civil cases pending. We don't want to point the finger of guilt, but this guy Goldberg is apparently married now, living, working for the Golf Channel. I'm not sure where he is physically located. Scott, 20 stab wounds. Have you ever heard of someone committing suicide by 20 stab wounds with injuries around their body? And what on earth could be going on here?
So I don't have a lot of experience in suicide calls, but I will say, as tough as this is to dive into, I have been on situations where there is just crazy display of madness, where you would walk in and say, this is not as obvious as a typical, and I say typical in the sense that there is a suicide by one means or another. The note is there, the evidence is there, plenty of witnesses to say, and a thorough investigation, because police have not concluded anything. Their only ways to result in our investigation leads to that the manner of death is by suicide, and then it is backed up by a coroner, right? And so when all parties are in agreement, it's somewhat of an end of story, a sad end of story, but the facts of the case are laid out. When you have something that does not seem like it's at all possible, where's law enforcement led to? If they walk in on a scene and they're leading to conclusions before they gather evidence, it can be bad for law enforcement, right, to draw conclusions without proper documentation, witness accounts, et cetera, et cetera. But this is absolutely confusing. It's mind-boggling. I recall a little bit of this in the news back, because this is my home turf. But it seemed to have died down, and with the exception of now the media attention and the family calling. The family never accepted that. And when you don't have the family backing up such a story, as tragic as it may be, and law enforcement closed the book, so to speak, sure, it leads to a tremendous amount, as well as it should, scrutiny. There are many confusing aspects to this. I wouldn't say that simply because somebody had stabbed themselves that it's a homicide. But, you know, what little I've read into with regards to the contradictions of the experts, the initial coroner, and then, of course, the follow-up advice of the experts that the family obtained that contradicts one stab wound versus another, superficial wounds. But if you have, you know, it's very confusing. But what I haven't seen is what led law enforcement to conclude that it was a suicide. What led law enforcement to lead or to persuade the coroner, if all that is true, to reverse, unless that evidence is astounding. If it's not overwhelming, at the very least, an indeterminate possible homicide, right? To leave an investigation open, to not conclude so quickly. And even if it took 10 years and the case had remained open, I mean, things would be altogether different, where the family understands that, hey, when all said and done and the evidence is concluded and collected, if you tell me one thing, I'll at least trust you and believe you because that's where the evidence leads you to. Or I wish you would find the perpetrator of this homicide because all the evidence has led to the fact that it's a homicide as opposed to a suicide. And if law enforcement simply cannot name a perpetrator simply because the evidence doesn't lead to, it would be in a different situation today. So this, but I have seen time and time again, even when the evidence is conclusive that it is a suicide, family and friends would not accept it. And so it's just tragic all the way around. But this one obviously calls for a lot more scrutiny. There's just, to me, so many unanswered questions. It's hard to put my mind around it.
And Phil, there's some more details here, and among them is the fact that, according to reports, the uncle, I believe it is, of the fiance was allowed back into the crime scene the day after, and was allowed to, and is apparently very high up or connected in Philadelphia politics, was allowed to leave with computers and other potential evidence. So things get very twisted and tricky. But Cyril Wecht, who is a famous forensic pathologist who challenged the single bullet theory in the JFK assassination, by the way, he reviewed this case, determined it was, quote unquote, strongly suspicious of homicide. I do not know, he wrote, how they wrote this off as a suicide. This is one of the preeminent forensic pathologists in the country. Henry Lee, who we interviewed on this show, also came out and concluded the number and types of wounds and bloodstain patterns observed are consistent with a homicide scene. Dr. Wayne Ross wrote that the stab wounds to the brain and spinal cord would have caused severe pain, cranial nerve dysfunction, and traumatic brain injuries. And then there's new evidence. So the parents, Sandy and Josh Greenberg, they have been very vocal. They talked to Nancy Grace not too long ago and say that there's no hemorrhaging from some of the stab wounds, which means that she wasn't bleeding, which means she was already dead when some of these stab wounds were inflicted. So it sounds like there are many, many unanswered questions, but I guess the same question to you. In all your time investigating homicides, did you ever come across a suicide where someone, you know, where you thought it was a homicide, but they just happened to stab themselves multiple times and died of their injuries?
Well, I have investigated suicides that were suicides. I have investigated scenes that were reported to be suicides and they were staged. They were not suicides. I've also had been unfortunate enough to experience the loss of several friends and one of my family members to suicide. So I can speak to the topic from that empathetic ear. Regarding this case, and I agree with what Scott has said, I have been in positions where I have had to, in fact, I was called to the chief of police's office in Houston to talk to some of his friends whose son had committed suicide and were not willing to accept it. So he asked me to review the case and offer my opinion and then come up and explain to them why this is what happened. And it is difficult. It's very difficult. I can tell you that the people that commit the act don't talk about it for the most part. They just go and do it. And people commit this type of act because for whatever reasons, and many of the times it's unknown. I had a friend of mine that was a homicide detective that shot himself in our office. And so it is unspeakable and it's unexplainable when it first happens. It's just what happened because nobody knew. And all the other ones that I've experienced in my personal life and professional life, no one knew. They just did it. And so it's very hard. And sometimes there was a note, sometimes there was not.
But the 20 stab wounds, does that raise eyebrows?
Well, yeah, in regards to this case specifically, I can just tell you that in my experience, I have been to scenes that appeared to be homicides and turned out to be either a suicide or a natural death. But because of some of the things that were going on there, first look at it was, and it was a family member that saw it, and this one that was a natural death. Oh my gosh, he was murdered because of the way it looked. But once we do the investigation, again, I have to let evidence lead me where I need to be. It's always a journey for the truth and so forth and so on. So in this case, I mean, I have read up about it. I've read about the news releases that at the time, and then now I think the latest ones were back in November of 2022, where they're getting some traction on some court rulings, and they want this thing changed either to homicide or undetermined. But this is one of these scenes where I don't think you can come to a ruling that this is undetermined. It's one or the other. And I mean, and not having looked at the evidence, I mean, and I hesitate to comment about things specific because I haven't read the case file. I haven't seen the crime scene photos. I've seen the stuff that they put on these pictures they've formulated with a computer generated thing and all this other stuff. So my first question is, in this particular case, is what was the cause of death? Was it multiple stab wounds, with one being the one that, because as I've read, the knife was left in her chest. Mm-hmm. And there's some suggestion that the body was moved. Well, does that mean that she moved herself? Because she was apparently found, as I've read, sitting in the kitchen and leaned up against a cabinet or something of that nature. So without having seen all of that stuff, it's really hard for me to say, make a definitive answer one way or the other, and I'm just not going to do that. So, but I would say that it looks crazy. I mean, it is an absolute insane scene. And I have worked since I've opened up my company. I have worked a couple of cases where a family member commits suicide and they want me to investigate it to prove that it was in fact a suicide. One of them was the use of a knife, and this person did some of these hesitation punctures and then eventually did the final one that caused their death. So the stuff in the back of the head, you've got people now that are saying, well, that would have caused this or that would have caused that. And the problem is with all this, I mean, I get what these experts are saying, but look, we're all given to speculation. And we're looking at stuff that happened 12 years ago. And we're trying to put together, it's like, you know, who shot JFK kind of a deal, right? So I'm just going to leave it with, it's possible. I mean, because at the beginning of this thing, the ME at the time ruled it a homicide. And remember, when they make these rulings, it's a medical legal ruling. It has nothing to do with criminal law. It's a medical legal ruling because there are homicides that are non-criminal. So they're going to rule it one of four things. It's going to be a natural, it's going to be a homicide, it's going to be a undetermined, or it's going to be accidental, or it could be a suicide. So 5 different types of rulings. And this one, the ME says that after the investigators got back with them and explained to them, and this is what happens, investigators, at least in my world, we always went to the autopsies and we talked to the medical examiner while they're performing the autopsy, answer their questions, tell them what we found at the scene, so forth and so on, so that they can make an educated ruling on what they see. And so if those investigators went back to the ME and explained some other parameters about this scene that caused him to change it to a suicide, then my question would be, what were those factors that caused that change in the ruling at that time? And it is a crazy scene. It's a crazy story. You certainly can't script this stuff. You know, the Goldberg, I think his name's Sam Goldberg, was he the fiance at the time, I think?
Fiance, yep.
He says something about he comes back to the apartment and has to break his way in, but then there's no indication that there was forced entry. So I'm wondering about DNA. I mean, forensic evidence, trace. I mean, I'm trying to look at this thing like I'd walk into it and I'm going to start an investigation. So I just wonder where some of that stuff's not even being talked about. So I don't know. I don't know, and I would be reluctant to even try to make a guess. This is a crazy thing that, and over the span of 12 years, where they've had people investigating it, and these pathologists coming in and saying this and that, and you know, the problem is with a lot of these secondary autopsies, which are nothing more, they're not in there cutting anything, they're just looking at the reports and the pictures. A lot of times these MEs that are paid, look, they're coming up with the conclusion they're being paid to come up with. And I don't know. It's just not good. It's not a good situation. I certainly, my heart goes out to the family. Yeah. They've been doing this for 12 years now. I mean, oh my gosh.
This is the kind of story I think where the media can have a big influence to crack it back open and see if there is a fire where there appears to be a lot of smoke. But it is time to wrap things up here. Agent Scott Duffey is director of Wilmington University's Criminal Justice Institute. He served as an FBI special agent for 20 years, as 5.5 years as a Pennsylvania police officer. we forgot to offer him our condolences on the Philadelphia Eagles, who I was rooting for, even as a Giants fan. I hope you've recovered. I know that is sensitive. I don't even like to offer condolences on that because.
Sorry, guys. I'm a Chiefs guy.
Oh, you are? Oh,
you know, they were, well, I'll tell you why. It's a short story, but it's a true story.
Yeah.
All my stories are true stories. The Chiefs were previously the Dallas Texans back in the 60s.
There you go. That's now you know why he likes the Kansas City Chiefs.
Yeah.
But we digress. We even talk about football here. You are an Eagles fan, I take it, Scott?
I am. And it's coming up on a week, but it was hard to take, but it was a great season. You know, I think we'll be back there.
You will be
next
back.
February.
Any final thoughts on anything, including football or not?
Just always a pleasure to be with you and Phil, and deep diving into the cases from long ago and current. It's I'm always glad to offer my perspective and see the comments.
Hey, Jonathan Gillum is off working. He's going to be unavailable for months, so we have to come up with a name for Phil and Scott Duffey. Doesn't quite rhyme like Phil and Gil, but send me your suggestions and we'll make it work. And that is that. You are looking at America's most respected detective in his Hawaiian shirt, spending 23 years as a homicide detective in the Houston PD. He's also a Marine and the owner of Kindred Spirits Investigations and the star of the show, The Interrogator. Any final thoughts on today's show? By the way, I'm thinking I'm blanking on his name, but there was whoever was playing before Lou Gehrig, I believe. I'm just blanking on his name, but he was sick one day, couldn't play, and Lou Gehrig took his position, and that was the end of the story. So could be the case with Jonathan Gillum and Scott Duffey. You miss a show, you get replaced by someone permanent. So a threat to Jonathan Gillum. But Phil, any final thoughts?
Well, we could call it Scruffy and Duffy.
I like it.
But that sounds more like a cartoon, so I don't know.
Well, we're cartoonish a little bit. I like it. Scruffy and Duffy. True.
No, I think today's show, you know, we covered some old topics and we covered some new stuff. So I think, and certainly there's enough crime out there that we should be able to cover a myriad of topics every week and kind of offer different perspectives of different events going on around the country and enjoyed it as always and enjoy the comments. I really, of course, I'm always reading the sidebar over here, as you put it, and some of the stuff that you don't post up here is pretty entertaining. So I want to tell you, whoever it was that
it was Wally Pipp, by the way, Frankie Figs, famous story, Wally Pipp, and he was sick, couldn't play.
Okay.
Lou Gehrig took over.
Okay. All right. Well, there you go. So
I didn't mean to interrupt you, Phil. What was
no. That's okay. So I look forward to it every week, and hopefully we'll get Jonathan will be back here in the saddle at some point. But I know when I left him in Houston a week or so ago that man, he was telling me what he's got ahead of him, and he's got a lot on his plate right now, is all I can tell you.
He's working hard, and we'll leave off with Miss Tree, Texans. Whoop, whoop. Sunday night, we are live with my mom doing the Ellen Greenberg mystery. I won't say murder mystery because it's ruled a suicide at the moment, but certainly a lot of intrigue there. Join us 7 o'clock Sunday night, 7 p.m. Eastern time. And Scott, wishing you a recovery from last week and the Eagles. Phil, aloha. Love you, America.